Hello, everybody. Oh, thank you, Matcha. Right, so F4 addressing, or actor addressing in general. Let me just see here. Is this the button I press? Ta-da! Okay, some background. We have a bunch of different address classes here because people like Steb are not psychic and did not come up with an extensible addressing scheme right at the very start. We've adapted, we've extended, we've expanded, et cetera, et cetera. So we've got 5 different address classes. So you see addresses starting F1 often or F3 for user addresses, F2, et cetera, et cetera. When we brought out the virtual machine, we brought in a new address class F4, which is an extensible address class. And for example, for Ethereum addresses, they start F410. And so what happens is the address kind of management is delegated to an actor that understands Ethereum addresses and can do the right thing. The problem with this being from various points of view to do with how you interact with those addresses. So developers, for example, have to be aware that they're dealing with a different address class, and there's some complications with how you send funds from one address class to another address class within Solidity code, for example. To further complicate things, Ethereum uses an address class that starts at 0x. And so we have a mapping. You can map directly one-to-one backwards and forwards between 0x addresses and F410 addresses. So you can go backwards and forwards. You can see an address that will be the same address represented in one or two ways. But like I said, this brings about problems. So just a couple of screenshots here, some user problems. One is sending fill from an exchange. So if you've got funds on somewhere like Coinbase or Binance or Bitstamp or wherever it might be, and you try to send it to a wallet, most exchanges at the moment still do not support the F4 address format. Coinbase just enabled it a few weeks ago. But what it means is you have to withdraw to a wallet on with an F1 address, and then from there send it to an F4 address. So it's this double hop that you've got to do. The typical way people have done it is using Glyph's burner wallets. So you create a burner wallet on Glyph. You go to their website, you can create like a temporary wallet, and then you send the addresses to there. As soon as the funds arrive at that address, you can then send it from the F1 address to an F4 address that you might have created in something like MetaMask, and that'll be represented as a 0x in its 0x format within MetaMask. So there's this double hop that you have to do, which is a pain. People have been asking, Binance still don't support it. We're in a bit of a catch-22 that Binance have said, well, we're not going to support it unless you have enough usage. And we're basically saying, well, we don't have enough usage because you don't support it. So we're in this bit of a loop with them. So it's a friction point. It's a friction point for developers. It's a friction point for working with the addresses. So really, this is a question about how we can address that. So yeah, all Ethereum actors have 2 0x style addresses. 0x addresses derived from F0 addresses are not stable because they change. And there's no way to send funds from an ETH account to an F1 account directly on chain. So that's kind of the problem. I'm kind of coming at it from representing kind of the developer and what they see. I don't know the underlying technical bit. That's the bit I'm going to hopefully pass over to Steb if there's sort of questions about why this is and the technical implications around it.
I first actually have some questions about the user feedback.
Yeah, sure.
So actually about all these different problems. So for example, when is when is having 2 0x style addresses a problem? How is this a problem? How is this like the main problem? Like what that kind of stuff?
I think the main problem that we're seeing, it really is getting funds onto the network. That's still the main one. I think some of the other ones are solvable. I think we've got libraries that allow you to send from an F4 address to an F1 address within a Solidity contract. There's workarounds to that. It's not.
Well, so sending from F4 to you mean so when a Solidity contract? Yeah. Oh, I see. Yeah, you have to use the native send.
Yeah, you've got to use the native one, and it's a little bit awkward. But we could wrap that. There's ways around that. I think the main issue we have are exchanges sending to, and we're kind of at their mercy.
Unfortunately, that is something we cannot fix. And that's actually something that has nothing to do with the FVM either. Like that's literally a problem of, like there are two problems there. One is the exchanges were basically parsing addresses and deciding to reject certain types of addresses because they felt like it. Part of this may have been because in the early network, we especially didn't have great tracing. So they needed to reject certain types of addresses because they couldn't trace it properly. Other ones were just exchanges being conservative. The second case of them not exporting 0x is just like we added support for 0x, they didn't. That's again not something that, unfortunately we just don't have any power for those cases. We're like, we can ask them politely.
Yeah,
Like
Jenny.
I work with like exchanges a lot, so I can
Sorry,
speak.
sorry, can you say that again?
I work with exchanges a lot on integrating with Filecoin. A couple challenges that we saw when we first introducing like this first is like it's very confusing to even explain to exchanges what the fuck is going on. Like, sure, you have F4, you have F like 0x, then you also have a burner account. Like, what the heck is going on? So that is already very complicated. And the other thing is like for exchanges, they have to, so like one of the use cases when we are selling it for exchanges to prioritize this issue was like, we are trying to give the user experience for ETH holders so that like, you know, they're just using the tooling they're familiar with, they're dealing with the wallet address they're familiar with, right? When exchanges come to this, they will be like, okay, so like, should I just use the ETH wallet I have for the users and use those 0x address to apply on Filecoin as well? And for them, that could be a security concern because like if I am sharing my 0x address for Ethereum and Filecoin, what happens, and I actually know that happened before, is like, okay, I was meant to send to ETH, but then somehow actually I got onto Filecoin, so that's a security concern for them. So they will be like, okay, we cannot do that, so that means we need to manage 2 wallet accounts for 1 Filecoin users. One is the regular one, which is the F1 address, and the other one is the F4 address. And for most of the exchanges, other than bridgings, they don't actually do double account management for single chain on the mainnet. And for a lot of the exchanges, it's like a UX issue. It's like now exchanges has to explain into their users. It's like, oh, for Filecoin, you actually can select 2 different addresses, and if you are this user, you select this one. If you are this user, selecting this one. And none of the other blockchain, like most of the exchanges I talked to, said we have never done that, and they basically just like pause there. The other problem with the burner address here, first is like security concern. Again, they are calling a smart contract. It's a very simple one-liner smart contract, but it's still a, you know, a thing that deployed by someone else, like maybe losing funds, like we don't know. And also, when you are making the transactions through the smart contract, you have to interpret the internal transaction, like the tracing, to actually properly accounting you basically have to get all the tracings for all the messages to monitoring the transactions to the exchange account. A lot of like exchanges simply doesn't support that, and that's where Binance is like getting blocked. For example, the other wallet F2 multi-sig wallet address on Filecoin also works that way. You have to look into the internal transaction trace to actually get the transactions. Because of the complexity, exchanges.
So that's when exchanges are receiving funds. You're saying?
Yeah, exactly. You have to monitor all the tracings, and like that's where exchanges like Binance was just like it's too much, and they didn't support multi-sig on Filecoin for 3 years. Thus, they are also not supporting that for F4 address for Filecoin.
Do you know, do the exchanges typically use Lotus, do you know, or
yes,
do we
they
not?
use Lotus.
They don't.
Mostly they use Lotus directly, or they use the Coinbase is using the Rosetta Sondex developed. Like Rosetta is basically a wrapping library, handles all the interface changes and so on and so forth.
Is it possible to make this easier at that level? For us to do that?
Sondex actually made all the changes needed for F4 and 0x on time. However, because it's a new library, like Coinbase has a very complicated system. They have different like layer, wallet security account, different management. It took a lot of time for them to figure out the update.
What if we added some feature to Lotus where you could literally say like, in this tip set, what were all of the transfers to this account or something like that?
That's literally what Rosetta is doing. They even wrap up the F40X like address mapping for you, and also the ID map. Interesting enough, though, only Coinbase is using Rosetta. I'm wondering why, and maybe that's another thing we can discuss, like to unify the pipeline so it's easier for people.
Coinbase developed Rosetta, so that could be why. Maybe they're the only ones using it because they developed it. But if they can solve it at the Rosetta level, then maybe that makes it easier for others to use.
Yeah, but I believe it's an open source library, and Sondex has been very helpful, like on supporting all those people. So I don't see why not.
Well, I'm just wondering if, for example, Binance is using Lotus directly. What if we just added a feature, basically, effectively took this feature from Rosetta and added it directly to Lotus, where you could just say, give me all the transfers to this account.
Right.
And it might solve it.
Yeah, one thing I want to highlight is the first point. This is not good, just to make sure it gets enough attention. So the fact that these actors have two addresses leads to the issue for developers who port contracts, right? They port contracts, and whenever a function accepts an address, and they need to do, and the contract does any kind of accounting, they need to normalize the address, because otherwise it can be recognized as different actor, even though this belongs to the same actor, right? So it's it can lead to the problem of found not being recognized or being even blocked, etc., right? So I think this is a major issue for porting, especially porting large contracts, and especially porting because you need to very carefully look at every function and make sure that you use the addresses correctly. So you start adding these one-liner pieces of code from the
I know there
library.
were some issues with Safe, previously known as Gnosis Safe, when they were trying to deploy contracts to FVM because they had to make some additional, they would have to have made some changes, which would result in a different address for that contract, and they want to have the same address for that contract across all chains. So they don't want to make special cases. So that would affect that.
Just going back to Coinbase topic. So when we say Coinbase enables F4 addresses just recently, can we also talk about how well or poorly they address the issue?
I don't know how well or poorly. I mean, from an end user, it works. I've tested it out recently, and it works fine, at least sending. I haven't tried depositing. I presume that works, but I didn't check to see whether it has a... I don't know whether they allocate an F4 address. I think the biggest issue is going from F1 to F4.
No, that...
Because the
so
F1...
the biggest challenge is actually, for Coinbase only supporting F4 doesn't actually serve what we wanted, because what we want is you are familiar with the Ethereum ecosystem, you are familiar with 0x wallet, you hold some fill, you want to be easily getting your fill into your 0x wallet. So unfortunately, Coinbase still doesn't support deposit to 0x. So users still have to do their own mapping from F4 to 0x, which is a little bit unfortunate.
Yeah.
Versus before. I'm trying to understand what is the incremental value of this F4 address system without 0x being enabled.
I don't see much.
I do. So with F4 addresses without 0x, it means that at least I can take my 0x style address and convert it to an F4 address using some tool. I think Glyph has one, and other people have them. Lotus can do this as well. Or if I have the F4 address of my wallet on chain, I can then withdraw from Coinbase into my multi-sig wallet that's written in Solidity. So that's the kind of stuff we can do. The next step there would be to link to documentation. I typically get Coinbase to do that. Link to some documentation that shows you how to convert. Unfortunately, you're going to be trusting whatever tool they link you to, and if that tool decides to give you the wrong address, they'll steal all your funds. So that becomes hard.
So I have a question. I'm seeing the third point over here. From my understanding, that is because we do require a masked, basically 0x ID address to send funds from an ETH account, right? We need ID address, and that's why if one address has to be activated first to get the ID address. Why is that? Why do we need all of those things? Can we not just have F2 for all and like go from there?
So actually, I can explain this. The way ETH accounts work is you always send an ETH transaction from this ETH account, and then we reformat it into a Filecoin message, and basically put all the other effectively put all the other fields into the signature in the ETH transaction, and then we validate this message. We basically reconstitute the original transaction by reformatting the Filecoin message into Ethereum transaction. The problem here is that in Ethereum transactions, the address is always a 20-byte address. It's always going to be that 0x 20-byte address. And like an F1 address for us is actually 21 bytes because you have the 1 in front that tells you an F1. F2 is also 21 bytes. F3 is like much larger because it has to include the entire BLS address. So the problem here is there are two problems. One, fitting the address into an Ethereum transaction isn't really possible. Two, even if, for example, like we were to like shave off one of the bytes of our F1 address to try to like make it fit, and then like say, well, as long like there might be ways of hacking this. The problem is like I still wouldn't be able to then look at those 20 bytes and say these 20 bytes belong, or sorry, unless that actor already exists on chain, I wouldn't be able to look at some 20 bytes and decide whether it should be a native account or if it should be an ETH account or if it should be an EVM. Like I wouldn't be able to know. So like, because the way this currently works is like, okay, if I send to 0x blah, 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 if it starts with FF, then a bunch of zeros and an ID, I convert it to an F0 address. If it's anything else, I convert it to an F410F address, basically. Then when I send to that, if there's no account there, I will, like, if it's an F410F address, I will just create an ETH account, basically, for that user. Or really, I create a quote-unquote placeholder for those funds and put the funds there. The problem is I can do this with F0 versus F410F with 0x style addresses. Sorry, there's too many numbers here. Basically, I can convert a 0x style address deterministically into either an F0 address or an F410F address, because there's masking. We're basically like we reserve an entire address range, which is 0xFF, a bunch of zeros, and then like an 8-byte ID. We reserve that entire address range in 0x for F0. So we have this nice separation. But if I try to like use the same trick for like public keys, like I'm only gonna, like the public key is already gonna be 20 bytes. I can't shrink it. So now I'm trying to like get like two 20-byte things into the same address space, and I would need some byte somewhere, like some reserved byte somewhere to like let me distinguish between the two, and we don't have that.
You were mentioning before Binance that you have people are complaining, but Binance has no interest, probably because they say, okay, why should we put resources into enable this? We already solved or did some package for Coinbase, and even if they managed to do it, if the case for Binance and many other exchanges is they don't want to put resources, maybe we could develop a small package in the language that they need, following the approach we did with Coinbase and Rosetta, and maybe this could unblock this.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of what Steb was alluding at earlier, was that, yeah, if they're using Rosetta, then if we can make the change in Rosetta kind of for them, or Jenny maybe somebody.
Well, sorry, we have, or Zondex made the change in Rosetta.
Oh,
so
okay.
that exists. We would, what we would do is probably make a change to Lotus, so that Binance could just directly call some API and it would be really easy.
Okay.
We still have to then convince them to do that. And like then it becomes the problem of like, it needs to make sense from a business perspective from them. They would need to like have a reason to do this.
Well, and it has knock-on effects in like the UI and like all these other things, right? So it's not just like, is it technically possible to do? It's like, you're going to exercise the entire stack at that point.
Yeah, we can even make it like not API breaking for Binance, right? Like in that case, because like if they're just doing all the parent message checking, we will just see, we can go through all the internal transaction like traces. If there's a F4, we will wrap it, right? Like the only thing they will have to keep is the indexing of their 0x and F4 addresses. That's the only thing they have to.
sorry, like the point I was trying to make is like we can literally just have an API where you just ask Lotus, like what are all the transactions to this yeah.
And that will be the parent message API that we have today, and we can just like work internally in that one. We don't even have to introduce a new API.
So the problem with the current system is like the only way to do this correctly is to basically ask for the full trace from a block and then walk the entire trace. My point here is that like it might be easier to just provide a very simple API where we say, here's a tip set, just tell me every single value transfer that succeeded to this address.
So effectively just a slightly higher level API on top of that existing
you
one.
could implement this as an external tool, and most people do, but we could just provide that, and it would make it very easy to just like, and you can even allow it for like epoch ranges, and I could consider users using this to like say, hey, what is the transaction history for my account? And it'll just give you the transaction history for your account.
Doing the state replay for them to get all the internal traces.
Exactly, yes. Yeah, sorry, we should.
Very slow API. Oh, sorry, but like that could be a very slow API. We probably want to actually have message indexing, like we just store it in the message indexing, and like read from that will be much faster.
It will be slow. I don't think that matters. Because in this case, like they're running that every single epoch and they're running it once, or ideally once. So like if we just like basically this would be the state replay. They could actually drop the state replay entirely and just use this because this is all the information they need. All they need to know is that like funds were sent to the address they care about.
The only issue was that is right now they only run state replay on the wallet address that they have that's involving the transaction. But like with this new API, what you are proposing is like literally running state replay on all the messages in the tip set, and then they find their like, interested transactions, which is like much more computations than what they're doing today.
No. We need to talk afterwards. It should not be more, Either they're doing it incorrectly or this will be faster.
One additional thing I was going to say is that, as far as I'm aware, I don't think like the Lotus send command will take a 0x address natively. Take an F4 address. You can't say Lotus send and give it a 0x address to send funds. So, I mean, I don't know if that helps, if we were able to do that. I don't know if that helps at all anybody else.
Sorry, Jenny was saying no one calls CLI. Another option here is maybe we can make the API handle this just automatically, and maybe that would make people happier. Yeah, but like my point is if we just do this in Lotus, then all the other exchanges that don't use Rosetta may be able to just like take what they have right now and just work. So maybe there's an oversight on our side.
We actually had that discussion upon launch. Oh, sorry.
No, I just wanted, given that there is an upcoming network upgrade in November, maybe it's a good time at least to reinitiate conversation with exchanges to understand what do they need or to do the change. And given that they are in any case going to make an upgrade in November, maybe it's a better timing to put a bit of extra effort to enable this.
Yeah. It's worth considering. The only tricky thing is like the code freeze is next week.
Okay, I mean, if
so
this,
like maybe
the solution
later.
is in Lotus, then maybe it's too late.
We actually thought about that during the network upgrade for FVM earlier this year. I believe the reason why we didn't do that back in the days is like we don't think Lotus, we didn't want to make Lotus too Ethereum-like, because like that's very opinionated. It's like we want to be a Filecoin implementations. We believe like we were hoping the ecosystem tooling can serve the need, and we don't have to put everything into Lotus, because Lotus is already a very like loaded implementation. Like, can you imagine you ask guests to implement an API for some Filecoin like address? It's just like a little bit weird, and that's why we didn't do it. However, if this has been such a problem for our users, and if we don't ever plan to actually remove it for 0x address, then we probably should consider doing that in Lotus.
Could you go the other way and implement the F1 addresses under the F4 addressing? That means that
doesn't help,
at all.
unfortunately. Like, yeah, so the problem is like here it's more users want to use 0x.
Yeah.
So we need to support that. The other problem is like we already have technically a unified addressing scheme. Okay, one of the problems was the fact that like the underlying byte structure of this addressing scheme wasn't like it meant that you had to like make basically changes to all, like to add a new addressing class, you have to change every single library that interacts with that. We hope we've solved this with F4, because the idea is that is the fully forwards compatible extensible address class, but that's still going to require adoption. There's no way around it. Yeah, and in terms of, I don't know, I think at this point, like the answer is really like, yeah, unfortunately, I don't think there's a simple, like straightforward, just purely technical solution here, other than like these two things we've talked about so far, which is like give people an easy API. Well, really just the one thing, give people easy APIs for doing everything they need to do, and then hope that that will help. But there are a bunch of other things we haven't talked about, which I do want to talk about more.
Yeah.
So like we mostly focused on the first one. No, it's not the first one. Actually, it wasn't even on. I didn't even put it up there. The extending from exchanges. The other problems we have are, for example, everything has a 0x or two 0x style addresses. Like I asked this question, but like I want to re-ask it because like, how big of an issue is this? Like, because we can fix this by basically saying like, you only get a 0x FF style address if you don't already have any other kind of 0x address. Like, would this be something that would be very valuable for users? Is it not worth our time? Like, that's the kind of question I'm wondering here.
I don't know. There's a question at the back. If someone get the microphone.
Yeah, just to recap on one of the points that were mentioned about the safe deployments. Right. I mean, like, I just had a report here. You were saying it was about that the safe team wanted to to keep the addresses on the same address on all the networks the same, right? However, I also see that when we try to deploy the factory contracts and all that, it just failed because the hyperspace network back then was not like fully compatible with the EVM as it's like supposed to be. However, I think it is now. So I mean, like, it's just like it's going to be good to recap and talk to you more on that because like we've done more than 30 deployments on different networks already, and we'll be more than happy to deploy on Filecoin as well.
Cool. Good.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, the question about the 20x address, I'm not sure. I don't know enough detail about that to really comment on that. So
Okay. The only reason I ask is like this is something that is actually solvable, where like there's a concrete technical solution that requires some amount of research and a little bit of effort, but it's not super hard. That's why I asked. We can do more research later. The other question I have is like, that third one up there. There's no way to send funds from an ETH account via MetaMask to an F1 account. This is something we've talked about many, many times, and it's what I was alluding to earlier when I said like you just can't fit an F1 address in a 0x style, like in an Ethereum address. How much do people run into this? I know people are not super happy with the forwarders. Would a more native forwarder work or help? Like, what kinds of?
Generally, I don't think it's been an issue because there is a way to do it, like you said, using like a native call. And generally, the only time you're sending, in most cases, to an F1 address from something to do with Ethereum is if you're doing something fairly Filecoin specific anyway. So you're kind of, I don't think that's that much of a change in headspace or a blocker at that point in time, right? The vast majority of the users I've come across are just going straight 0x addresses to F4 addresses because that's all they're dealing with. Generally, they're only sending to F1 addresses if there's a very specific reason to do so, and generally that's not too much of an issue for them.
The reason I ask is like there are a bunch of potential solutions here, but they all have their own issues. For example, like some of the earlier F4 proposals had this concept of like after the fact being able to bind an F4 address to an existing actor, where like in this case, like I could have an F1 account, and then later on I could bind as F4 or sorry F410F or a 0x style address to this F1 account. The problem we ran into there is that basically before you run some explicit message that binds them together, you could end up creating both accounts side by side. Just because depending on how we do this, and I think actually basically every way we do this, you wouldn't be able to tell up front whether or not, like, how do I put this? Yeah, basically, like, you might not be able to tell like what type of account you should put there. So you end up putting two different accounts on chain, which means you get two actors, and then you literally need to like merge them somehow. So that's why we didn't go with that route. But I did want to bring that up because that was something we did consider. But effectively, you end up with like two ID addresses potentially for a single account, which is not great. We also talked about potentially like having forwarding or something like that, where like you could create some other proxy, an F410F proxy that would then like send or forward things. But then like if you ask for this proxy's balance, what balance do you give?
Yeah, I mean, that would be one way to do it, because the reason you can't send from the reason you can't implement that at the moment is because the only way to implement that on a sort of a user level is with a smart contract, which means it's an F4 address, which means you kind of got, you've got a chicken and egg scenario. You can't send from F1 to that F4 address to where that code would be to forward it. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's why you can go the opposite direction, and there is, I think it's Glyph deployed a contract called Fill Forwarder that you can send from an F4 address to this contract, and it will then send it on to an F1 address. Yeah. But you can't go the other direction because the F1 address, it would turn up at something that doesn't know, unless you were to implement that at a lower level as a system actor or something like that. Would a WASM actor, I've got no idea, if you're doing, when we get to WASM actors and native actors, would they have F1 addresses?
Yes. Sorry, no. Like native, so if you're deploying a native actor, you usually get an F2 and an F0, and potentially an F4, but not an F410F. So like the idea behind F4 is that like anyone can extend it into their own address class and whatever, they can do whatever they want with it. But the reason we have all these insane addresses is like F0 is how we interpret IDs, and it's supposed to be like the short way, the very efficient way of representing things. F1 and F3 are different key addresses derived from keys. F2 is the stable address. So the problem we had was like, okay, if I have an actor deployed on chain, I have no way of like the ID of that actor is not stable. So we needed some way of like deriving some stable address for that actor, even across like message reorgs and stuff like that, or block reorgs or message stuff. So that's where that's where that address class came from. And this is also why like even when we use F4 addresses, we still actually assign F2 addresses because technically there's no hard guarantee that an F4 address will be stable. It is usually stable, at least with the EVM. EVM addresses are usually stable, but there isn't even a guarantee about that. So it's, I don't know.
Would there be a way to create some sort of workflow where you could, as a user, like effectively generate an F1 address that is bound to an F4 address such that it is forwarded automatically? Anything comes in that F1 address goes to the F4 address.
So like usually I assume the problem is the other way around, where like you need to, because like the EVM tooling is more restrictive. So you want to go from like 0x to F1, not from F1 to 0x, unless I'm missing, or F1 to like the Ethereum land. What am I missing here? Like basically, why would I want to assign an F1 address to my EVM actor or my ETH account?
So that you could withdraw from say Coinbase would be happy with an F1 address because you're giving an F1 address, and as far as it's concerned, it's just sending it to an F1 address. But by the time it gets to the actual, the blockchain, when it hits that F1 address, there's something there that forwards it to the F4 address.
Honestly, the only answer you have there is like you have some kind of DApp where like a temporary account is created in your browser, and then you but then you have problems of like if you if your computer crashes, you lose the funds or something like that. So like.
No, I was thinking something actually on chain.
You could, but this becomes very hacky.
Becomes bloaty, I suppose. Yeah.
Because like F1 addresses are supposed to be for just these special accounts or for like the accounts. We could allow that. Honestly, the right solution here is get rid of the roadblocks preventing exchanges from sending to these address types, and then just let them do that. And I think I do think adding an API to Lotus or adding a couple APIs to Lotus or change the APIs to just make it work will make them happier. One of the big problems that I think in the past is just literally they had a regex, literally a regex for just determining is this a valid address when they should have just not validated it, and just but yeah. It's software engineers.
Neither Jenny nor Scott. Oh no, you are there. I was about to say.
Sorry, could you elaborate on how does the F4 address can change? Well, what are the cases in which they can change it?
A zero if you're addressing an Ethereum of a smart contract, it's more like how to put this? The F2 addresses exist so that I can create a smart contract on chain and then refer to it like basically in the next message in a chain of messages and have that address be stable. In theory, at least on Ethereum, like because the address of a smart contract, if I create a smart contract with the create opcode on chain, so like if I send a message to some actor on chain, that actor on chain creates another smart contract with a create opcode, then the address of the smart contract I'm creating depends on the order in which messages were executed.
The nonce.
Yeah. No, not the nonce. Not just the nonce. The problem is, sorry, it depends on the from address and the nonce of the actor that caused the creation, not the message that I sent. Which means that so like in Filecoin though, the F2 address depends on the nonce and the address of the actor that, the account that sent the top level message. So it means that if I'm sending a bunch of messages in a chain, I can just assume like these addresses are much less likely to change. There are ways in which they can change still, but like they're less likely to change. The problem is you don't quite get that guarantee in Ethereum, where like if I go through some proxy on chain, basically if I create some some smart contract on chain through some proxy, then if some other message happens to execute before mine in a block, I can't rely on like the address being the same. Now, people don't do this very often. So maybe this was not worth worrying about, but like the problem is more generally, F4 is not just for Ethereum actors. It's actually a very general purpose address space where like we're literally delegating an entire address space to some other actor on chain that gets to decide how to assign addresses, and that actor could do whatever it wants. So we wanted to ensure that every single actor on chain just had a stable address so that you could use that stable address from messages, or from these message chains, so you could basically create a chain of messages and send them all at once. Now, maybe the better approach here would be to say, instead of making message chains, maybe you should like actually send a whatever it's called, a multi-transaction or whatever they call those, a batch transaction. That's the better approach probably. Well, it's probably a combination of that plus fast finality. So either you send a batch of messages or you have finality that's basically one epoch, so you don't care. Those two together would have solved the issue without having to have stable addresses, but especially at Filecoin launch, we needed these stable addresses. I don't know. Maybe eventually we just get rid of F2 addresses if we can get all the other guarantees.
Thank you.
I don't want to I don't want to get ahead of myself, but like 4.2, talking about address are not stable. When we have fast finality and we can actually finalize at the epoch itself, that is resolved immediately, right?
Halfway. So like we need that plus the ability to send like a batch of messages at once, but that can be implemented in user space.
Elaborate on the batch, please.
So the problem is like if I send multiple messages in the same epoch, I want to make sure that either all executed or not all executed.
So is that the delayed execution problem again?
Well, actually, do I care?
A little bit, right? Because like you need the exact like ordering for execution, and then.
Let me think. Actually, no. Sorry. Unfortunately, I don't think it's entirely solved. So no, never mind. Batching is not important. I forget what I said there. That's actually not important. No, the thing we're still missing here though is like I would still need to send one message that would create the actor. Then I would need to wait an epoch. Then I would need to send the rest of the messages. Where with the current system, I can literally, without even waiting a single epoch or for finality, I just send messages.
But like that UX will be already way better.
Oh,
like
yeah,
waiting
much
like
better.
1 minute is way better than waiting like 7.5 hours, I guess.
Yeah, that would solve point 2 up there.
Yeah,
well.
it means just like Forest and Lotus need to work on Granite over
Yes,
Q4.
Granite would be very, very nice.
Great.
Okay, I think we are out of time.
I think we are.
Thank you,
Cool.
everyone.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much.
So just like wrap up a couple things. So we basically said, yes, it's time. We actually need to make Lotus even more loaded. Or maybe we can consider having that in Forest and like exchanges around Forest node. Maybe we can coordinate a little bit because like Forest node are lighter than Lotus already. So like maybe it's a better option. But like one of the implementation needs to provide a Rosetta-like interface for exchanges so that it serves all the transaction needs for Filecoin message indexing and deposit. The second thing is like talking about fast finality more in protocol track tomorrow or Wednesday, shameless plug in, and then we will make that happen. Thanks.
Cool.